It did not begin with weapons or war. It began with cement. On a quiet morning in Burkina Faso, cranes lifted steel beams into the air. Engines roared, and red dust rose from the ground. Before the eyes of workers, farmers, students, and engineers, a new project was born. A cement plant with the capacity to produce 2,000 tons every single day. For the first time in the nation's history, the foundation of its future would no longer depend on imported materials from Paris or Marseille. This plant was not financed by the World Bank, not designed by French contractors, not controlled by European investors. It was built through a bold agreement with China. And yet, something so simple, cement, sent shockwaves across the world. Newsrooms in Paris roared with alarm. Think tanks in Washington rushed to issue reports. Western financial circles held emergency meetings. Why would a single cement factory, something so ordinary, be treated as a geopolitical earthquake? To the people of Burkina Faso, this was not just a construction site. It was freedom made visible. To Western media, it was labeled dangerous anti-colonialism. For decades, Burkina Faso's schools, hospitals, and bridges were built with imported cement, each bag carrying a hidden price of dependency. A country rich in limestone and clay was forced to buy back what it already owned, at 3 or even 5 times the cost. The profit never stayed in Africa. It was siphoned abroad, while the people remained poor. That morning, President Ibrahim Traoré stood before the crowd and declared with unwavering resolve, "We will not build our future with bricks borrowed from those who once looted our ancestors. From this day forward, our cement is truly ours." His words ignited something greater than applause. They lit a fire of pride, a symbol of defiance, and a new chapter in the struggle for African independence. But what makes this factory so dangerous to the old order? And why are Western powers trembling over something as basic as concrete? The answer lies not in the bricks themselves, but in what they represent: the right to choose. To understand why a cement plant could shake the world, we must look back at the long shadow of dependency that defined Burkina Faso for decades. Independence in name did not mean independence in reality. For more than 60 years, the nation's schools, hospitals, and bridges were built with materials imported from Europe. Each brick carried a hidden weight, not just of cost, but of control. In Paris, a bag of cement might cost $3. By the time it reached Ouagadougou, the same bag sold for 16. The difference was not invested back into African workers or African families. It was absorbed by foreign companies and foreign banks. French construction giants like Lafarge, Vinci, and Bouygues controlled the market through exclusive contracts signed in the 1960s. These contracts tied loans, materials, and technical expertise into a single package. If a Burkinabe government wanted to build a hospital, it could only do so by importing French cement. If it wanted to pave a highway, the deal required French contractors. The system was airtight. A leaked report from 2019 confirmed what many suspected. Nearly 80% of national infrastructure projects relied on cement imported from France. Another investigation, known as Africa Leaks, revealed how commissions flowed quietly from European firms into the personal accounts of former officials. One email exposed the practice clearly. "Each contract includes a 10% bonus," it read. "If signed early, there is an additional 10% in special incentives." Corruption was not an accident. It was built into the system. Even education was shaped to ensure dependency. For more than 30 years, Not a single Burkinabe cement engineer was trained to international standards. Scholarships were offered by France, but they came with strings attached. Graduates were placed into French companies or returned home only to find that jobs had been reserved for foreign experts. The policy was never designed to build local capacity. It was designed to crush self-reliance before it could begin. International organizations stood by. The IMF, the World Bank, and USAID all knew how the system worked, yet they stayed silent. Their role was not to dismantle the dependency, but to preserve it under the label of development. Aid was never free. Every loan came with conditions that funneled profits back to Europe. According to a report from the United Nations Development Program, for every $1 of aid Burkina Faso received for infrastructure, $1.70 flowed back to Europe through imported materials and contractor deals. Aid was not designed to build. It was designed to extract. The result was a painful paradox. Burkina Faso sat on vast deposits of limestone, clay, and gypsum, the very raw materials required to make cement. Yet the people lived in mud homes, while imported cement lined the shelves of foreign-owned warehouses. Every school that opened, every bridge that spanned a river, was a reminder that sovereignty had limits. Even the bricks beneath a child's feet did not belong fully to the nation. This reality shaped not only economics, but psychology. Generations grew up believing that building was impossible without foreign permission. Leaders were praised when they signed contracts quickly, even if the deals bled the country dry. When a nation cannot even produce the materials to construct a classroom, the very idea of independence becomes hollow. That was the foundation on which Burkina Faso stood for decades. A nation rich in resources, yet forced to import its own potential at inflated prices. A people capable of building, yet denied the tools to do so. Dependency had become so normal that when Ibrahim Traoré announced plans for a domestic cement plant, many could hardly believe it. To some, it seemed almost impossible that the system could be broken. But Traoré understood a deeper truth. Real independence is not written in speeches. It is laid in bricks and mortar. It is measured in schools built with local cement, in bridges constructed without foreign invoices, in workers trained not abroad, but at home. That is why the announcement of a single factory made headlines from Paris to Washington. It was not only about cement. It was about the end of an era in which every building project came with a foreign signature at the bottom of the page. When the old system seemed unbreakable, Ibrahim Traoré chose a different path. In March of this year, without the noise of press conferences or the parade of foreign dignitaries, he sat down with a Chinese trade delegation in Ouagadougou. There was no red carpet, no champagne, no long speeches. On the table rested a single folder. Inside was a blueprint for something that had never existed in Burkina Faso's history. A large-scale cement plant, powered by Chinese technology, funded by the China Development Bank, and designed to train a new generation of Burkinabe engineers. Within 48 hours, the deal was signed. Western embassies were not consulted. No approval was sought from the World Bank. No advice was taken from USAID. The IMF was not even informed. For the first time in decades, Burkina Faso acted entirely on its own terms. The silence in Western capitals quickly gave way to outrage. Analysts asked why such a poor nation would dare to bypass their oversight. But that was precisely the point. The deal represented a quiet revolution. What made this agreement different was its transparency. Traoré insisted that every clause be presented in front of Parliament and the press. Nothing would be hidden behind closed doors. The equipment came with full technology transfer, not rented expertise. Over 500 Burkinabe engineers and workers began training alongside Chinese experts, learning how to design, operate, and maintain the plant. This was not a loan that shackled the future. It was a partnership that built capacity. Most striking of all, 60% of the factory's ownership remained in the hands of the Burkinabe state. The remaining shares were divided between local engineers and independent investors. Unlike the colonial contracts of the past, which left Africa owning nothing but debt, this project ensured that control would remain with the nation itself. At the groundbreaking ceremony, Ibrahim Traoré spoke words that electrified the crowd. "We will not build our future with bricks borrowed from those who once looted our ancestors. From this day forward, our cement is truly ours." The statement was more than political theater. It was a declaration that Burkina Faso would no longer accept development defined by others. The symbolism ran deep. Cranes turned, excavators roared, and red dust rose into the sky. For workers watching the site come alive, this was not just another project. It was a promise that their labor would no longer serve foreign shareholders. It was a reminder that dignity could be poured into every foundation, that sovereignty could be molded in every brick. To reinforce this message, Traoré launched the Cement for Independence campaign. A new policy required that all state-funded infrastructure projects prioritize the use of locally produced cement. Schools, hospitals, and bridges would now be built from the nation's own soil, not from overpriced imports. Within months, the results were visible. Costs of construction fell by more than 40%, and projects that had been stalled for years suddenly accelerated. The partnership with China was not without critics. Western commentators immediately accused Burkina Faso of falling into a so-called debt trap. Yet the structure of the deal told a different story. There were no hidden interest rates, no mortgaged resources, no exclusive concessions. The technology and training were part of the agreement from the beginning. Unlike the old French model, this was not extraction disguised as aid. It was cooperation rooted in mutual respect. For ordinary citizens, the change was not abstract. It was visible in the new jobs created, in the wages earned, and in the pride of producing something with their own hands. A young worker named Madu, once employed carrying heavy bags of imported cement in the markets of Ouagadougou, now stood proudly on the factory floor. "I used to sweat carrying their cement," he said. "Now I make my own." His words captured the transformation more powerfully than any policy paper ever could. In less than a year, the vision of sovereignty once thought impossible had become real, and the lesson was clear. Independence does not arrive with declarations. It arrives when a nation builds with its own materials, trains its own people, and owns the tools of its own future. That is what Ibrahim Traoré understood when he placed that single folder on the table. The plant was not just a construction project. It was the blueprint for a new Africa, one that refuses to beg for the right to build. The true power of the cement plant did not lie in speeches or headlines. Its impact was written into the daily lives of ordinary Burkinabe citizens. Within months of its groundbreaking, the changes were already visible. For decades, building a school in a rural province required waiting for imported materials to arrive, often at 5 times the real cost. Projects dragged on for years. Communities were left with half-finished clinics, crumbling roads, and empty promises. Suddenly, With a domestic supply of cement, the timeline shifted. Schools that once took 3 years to complete were finished in less than 12 months. Bridges that had remained only blueprints for decades were finally being built. The numbers told part of the story. In the first 6 months, construction costs dropped by over 40% nationwide. 300 new elementary schools rose across rural areas. 19 hospitals and community health centers that had been delayed for years opened their doors. 6 strategic bridges, connecting agricultural regions to markets, were completed ahead of schedule. What had once been impossible suddenly became routine, but the impact went beyond statistics. For workers, the factory created more than 2,000 jobs in production and distribution. These were not temporary contracts with no future. They came with technical training, skill development, and long-term stability. Young men and women who once dreamed only of leaving for Europe found themselves learning to operate heavy machinery, manage production lines, and supervise logistics. The migration pressure that had drained communities for decades began to ease as opportunities opened at home. The psychological effect was just as important. For generations, Burkinabe citizens had lived in a paradox. They stood on rich deposits of limestone and clay, yet their houses crumbled with mud walls. They watched imported cement carried through markets, stamped with foreign logos, as if their own soil had no value. Now, with every locally produced bag stacked high in warehouses, a new pride emerged. Children walking into schools built with Burkinabe cement carried more than books. They carried proof that their nation could stand on its own. One story captured this transformation. In the northern province of Kaya, a young boy named Yakuba stood before a new classroom built entirely from local cement. His teacher asked what the walls meant to him. He replied, "It means I will not have to beg for my future." His words spread across social media, turning into a slogan repeated on banners and murals. For once, education was not only about knowledge, it was about dignity. The economic ripple extended further. Local businesses flourished as transport companies, suppliers, and distributors entered the cement chain. Farmers who once struggled to sell their produce on broken roads now reached markets faster because bridges had finally been built. Women cooperatives, long excluded from industrial sectors, gained opportunities through logistics and small-scale construction contracts. Slowly, the factory became more than an industrial site. It became an ecosystem that breathed life into communities. Politically, the success of the plant gave Traoré a stronger mandate. Citizens who had grown cynical after decades of empty promises now saw tangible results. Campaign slogans were replaced with real buildings, roads, and clinics. Even opposition figures struggled to deny the visible transformation. The factory had become a symbol that transcended politics, uniting the nation around a shared sense of possibility. The cultural effect was equally profound. In songs, in poetry, in graffiti across Ouagadougou, cement was no longer seen as just a material. It was called the bricks of freedom. Artists painted murals of workers holding cement bags like torches, lighting the way toward a new future. Students organized debates about economic independence, using the factory as their case study. What was once technical infrastructure became a living metaphor for sovereignty. None of this came without resistance. Western media rushed to portray the project as reckless, warning of a so-called Chinese trap. Yet inside Burkina Faso, the narrative was different. People compared their new clinics, schools, and bridges with the broken promises of imported aid. For them, The plant was proof that independence was not an illusion. It was something they could touch, walk on, and learn inside of. By the end of the year, the story of the cement plant had become part of daily language. When neighbors spoke of progress, they did not speak of international donors. They spoke of bricks, bridges, and classrooms. The shift was subtle, but historic. Independence was no longer an abstract slogan chanted at rallies. It was molded into every road, every hospital, every school. It was written in concrete, and it could not be erased. The cement plant did not only shake Burkina Faso, it sent shockwaves across international capitals. In Paris, Washington, and Brussels, what looked like a simple construction project was treated as a strategic crisis. Western media outlets rushed to frame the agreement as dangerous. Reuters called it reckless. The BBC spoke of a new dependency on China, and French newspapers labeled Traoré a rebellious leader destabilizing West Africa. None of them focused on the schools or hospitals being built. Their concern was profit and influence slipping away. France reacted with particular intensity. The foreign minister summoned Burkina Faso's ambassador to Paris, demanding clarification of the country's new investment policies. French media warned openly that thousands of jobs in Marseille and Toulouse, tied to cement exports, could be lost. Former officials from the Ministry of Finance did not speak of African development. They spoke of French unemployment. The mask was lifted. What mattered was not human rights or poverty reduction, but the flow of money back to Europe. In Washington, the response was equally revealing. A report from the U.S. National Security Committee placed Burkina Faso on a watch list for what it called non-transparent agreements with a strategic competitor. One congressman even declared on live television, "We are losing Africa to Beijing, one bag of cement at a time." The symbolism of that statement could not be missed. What the West feared was not concrete, but control. The United Nations became another battlefield. During a session in New York, the French representative questioned the transparency of Burkina Faso's cement deal with China. The Burkinabe ambassador replied with a sharp retort. "If you want to talk about transparency, start by releasing every Lafarge contract in Africa from the past 30 years. The room fell silent. No delegate had an answer. Pressure soon shifted from words to tactics. Several development loans to Burkina Faso were quietly suspended. Aid organizations withdrew staff under the excuse of security concerns. International insurers raised premiums on goods bound for the country. These measures were designed not to protect stability, but to remind Burkina Faso of its place in the global hierarchy. Yet Traoré and his cabinet had anticipated such moves. Foreign currency reserves were mobilized, regional banks provided emergency credit, and partners like Mali, Niger, and Guinea expressed open support for the new model of self-sufficiency. Instead of weakening the project, international pressure gave it more visibility. Images of Traoré holding the blueprint of the cement factory with the slogan, "Build our own future," went viral across Africa, Europe, and the Caribbean. On social media, millions shared the message. Hashtags celebrating African self-reliance trended for days. Western accusations of debt traps could not compete with the sight of new schools and hospitals built in record time. The panic spread further because Burkina Faso's decision began inspiring others. Mali and Niger expressed interest in similar projects, seeking to free themselves from decades of overpriced imports. In Ghana, student unions organized debates on economic sovereignty, pointing to Burkina Faso as an example of what true independence looks like. In the African diaspora, From Paris to New York, murals of Traoré began appearing with captions like, "Freedom is built, not borrowed." Western governments feared this ripple effect more than the factory itself. For decades, their influence had rested on the assumption that Africa would remain dependent, unable to act without permission. Now, a landlocked nation, once dismissed as fragile and poor, was rewriting the rules. If Burkina Faso could build without foreign aid, what excuse did others have? To regain control of the narrative, Western think tanks produced reports warning of hidden costs and strategic risks. Yet on the ground, those warnings sounded hollow. Parents sending their children to new classrooms cared little about geopolitics. Farmers crossing sturdy new bridges thought less about global competition and more about getting their crops to market. For ordinary people, the cement plant was not a foreign threat. It was a lifeline. This disconnect between elite panic and popular hope defined the international reaction. The old powers saw a challenge to their authority. The people of Africa saw a door opening to a future no longer dictated from abroad. And in that tension lies the deeper significance of Burkina Faso's decision. Because if a single cement plant could provoke emergency meetings in Paris and Washington, what would happen when dozens of nations followed the same path? What would happen when Africa began to build not just factories, but a new order, one in which sovereignty was measured not in borrowed loans, but in the strength of local foundations? That is the question haunting Western capitals tonight. The story of Burkina Faso's cement plant is not simply about bricks and mortar. It is about a nation daring to claim what was always its own. For the first time, schools are built with local materials, bridges rise without foreign approval, and hospitals stand firm on foundations molded by Burkinabe hands. Yet beneath the dust of construction lies a deeper truth. This is not just infrastructure. It is defiance written in concrete. Across Africa, people are watching. From Bamako to Lagos, from Niamey to Johannesburg, the sight of Burkina Faso breaking ground without foreign permission has become a symbol of possibility. If one of the poorest, landlocked nations can free itself from overpriced imports and political conditions, what excuse remains for the rest of the continent? Already whispers are turning into debates, debates into plans, and plans into movements. And this is what frightens the old powers most. They understand that independence is contagious. If one country shows that sovereignty can be built with its own soil, then others will follow. That is why Paris panics, why Washington scrambles, why every Western headline suddenly screams of risks and dangers. They are not afraid of cement. They are afraid of Africa building for itself. But even as the cranes rise and workers cheer, new questions emerge. Will this project withstand the sabotage, the financial blockades, the propaganda campaigns already underway? Will other African leaders have the courage to follow, or will they hesitate under Western pressure? And perhaps the most haunting question of all, is this factory a single step, or the first stone in the foundation of a new African order? The dust has only begun to settle in Ouagadougou, but the echo of machines mixing concrete is already being heard across the continent. Every bag of cement poured into the soil carries a message. Africa will no longer beg for bricks to build its future. And so we are left with the cliffhanger. Is Burkina Faso's cement plant just a factory? Or is it the spark that will ignite Africa's long-awaited rebirth?